So welcome everyone to our Dynamics of Domestic Violence presentation. This is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, October. So we thought this would be a really good presentation to have right now to really talk about the dynamics and get a more thorough understanding of domestic violence and what Monarch does as an organization. And so with that, I am our project manager. My name is Sydney Woodward. I do a lot of our community outreach events such as this, as well as doing a lot of grant writing and grant reporting for Monarch. And I'll let my co-facilitators introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, my name is Delphine Burns. I'm communications manager with Monarch Services. So I'm responsible for a lot of our media outreach, press releases, also community engagement, social media, just making sure that we're getting our message out there into the community. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
And hello everyone, my name is Dalia and I am also here with Monarch Services. My title is Education and Community Outreach Advocate. So I work very closely with both Sydney and Delphine. And on top of that, we also do a lot of education to high schoolers, middle schoolers, and a lot of our community partners and our community in general. So thank you everyone for being here and we are going to get started. So to begin, objectives for today, or what we hope you gain from this presentation, is an understanding of what domestic violence is, what it can look like, and who is affected by it. Also understanding the dynamics of a domestic violence relationship, and learn how to support someone or be a better support person for a survivor. So if anyone would like to type in the chat what domestic violence is, or maybe what you know about it, what images come to your mind, or domestic violence and intimate partner violence relationships related, and if there's a difference between domestic violence and abuse. So go ahead and type that in the chat, and we'll be reading a few.
So we have Brenda Ortiz saying physical and verbal aggression, yes. Who else? Mental violence, absolutely. We have no difference between DV and abuse. Image comes to mind as a cycle.
Maybe one more before we move on to our next slide.
There's no wrong answers, just trying to get a feel for, you know, what comes to our minds so then we can make sure that we meet our objectives. Chaotic circumstances. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for sharing those. Definitely, they all fall under domestic violence, 100%. So next we have the definition here from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So I'll just briefly read it. Domestic violence is the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or other abusive behavior as part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. This includes physical violence, sexual violence, threats, and emotional abuse. The frequency and severity of domestic violence can vary dramatically. I want to point out that the part that says systematic pattern of power and control, that is kind of what I hope in this presentation we gain an understanding of the power and control dynamic, because that is a big factor when it comes to domestic violence.
Okay, and so we are going to talk about, what abuse can look like. And so one thing I do want to highlight, this is a domestic violence / intimate partner violence presentation. We may use those terms interchangeably, but that we know that domestic violence, intimate partner violence aren't the only forms of abuse. We see this with, elderly abuse. We see that abuse can range in all kinds of different scenarios and situations. But when it comes to domestic violence, California domestic violence law says about that abuse is physically hurting or trying to hurt someone intentionally or recklessly. A lot of the time survivors will think, oh, it wasn't abuse, they didn't intentionally harm me. But even if it's reckless abuse, or reckless abuse, like somebody, accidentally harms another person in a power and control manner, then that would, under California state law, be considered abuse. Sexual assault is abuse. Making someone reasonably afraid that they or someone else are about to be seriously hurt. So this can be threats, like promising to hurt somebody, promising to hurt somebody that they love. Or behavior like harassing, stalking, threatening, hitting someone, disturbing someone's peace, and destroying someone's personal property. And so we're going to get into some of the dynamics of why abuse isn't always physical here in a minute. So who's affected by domestic violence? So we know that violence does not discriminate. All community types, all religious backgrounds, all educational backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, races, gender identities, and sexual orientations, and all physical and mental abilities. So violence does not discriminate. There, used to be kind of this idea that only certain kinds of families experience domestic violence, but we know that that is not the case. One thing we do know, however, is that there might be unique vulnerabilities that certain individuals have that, make it so that somebody will prey on those vulnerabilities. But as Brené Brown says, to be human is to be vulnerable. And because of that, there is no one way that domestic violence can look. It's not just poor families who, experience domestic violence. It's not just people of a certain gender or a certain race. And even now, we still have a lot of language and images that talk very much in a gendered way around domestic violence, really talking about, women being the survivor and men being the perpetrators. But what we know is that is not always the case. Men can be survivors of domestic violence just as much as women can be survivors of domestic violence. And when we do talk about, domestic violence in that gendered way, we almost always ignore trans and non-binary people who can also be survivors of domestic violence. So how does this affect our communities overall? So intimate partner violence is widespread. We know this, that it is incredibly common, unfortunately. So 1 in 4 women, so 25%, and 1 in 9 men were the victims of some kind of contact of sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner. We also know that sexual violence impacts men and women, with about 1 in 3 women and nearly 1 in 6 men being the victims of sexual contact, of sexual violence at some point in their lives. And we know that just like with sexual assault, just like with other topics we cover with human trafficking, that some of these crimes are underreported. This is specifically especially true when the victim is male. So if a survivor is a man, they are much less likely to report being abused or sexually assaulted. And we know that's because a lot of stigma around, what it means to be a man, and the socialization around men thinking they have to be one way, or that assuming that men are the aggressors. And again, in these statistics, which these come from Ultraviolet, in these statistics, again, we are completely ignoring or erasing trans and non-binary individuals. And so how does it affect communities overall? So I think it's important to note that there are still 29 states where if a woman is a survivor of domestic violence and their partner, and it's usually women, this one is very disproportionately impacting women. If their child is also being abused by the person who's causing harm, the woman will go to jail under failure to protect laws. We've seen this in cases actually a couple of years ago BuzzFeed News did a great expose where many women were jailed across various states for failure to protect. And in one instance, it was a boy who was also being abused by his stepfather as much as his mom was. And he, was saying that, I wish I had never told anybody, because his mom got 14 years in jail for failure to protect, but his stepfather, who was sexually assaulting him, got 4 years. So these laws disproportionately impact women, and they disproportionately impact women of color. We know that women of color are vastly overrepresented in our jails, and these failure to protect laws almost always target women of color. Additionally, we know that over 3/4, 75% of women who are in prison are survivors of domestic violence. So we never look at the dynamics of trauma that led to these women, being in the situations that they were in. And we need more research around here. Like, we really need more research around how this also impacts trans people and non-binary people. But in California specifically, 67% of women in prison who went to prison for killing somebody were doing so in self-defense from domestic violence. So we didn't protect those people when they were being abused, but then are criminalized when they finally do the ultimate act to stop the abuse from happening. And we really need to think about that, how we as a society can make sure that we have these safety nets in place so that it doesn't get to that point. And so it's really important to know that domestic violence doesn't just look one way. Oftentimes survivors and just the general population at large assume that domestic violence is always physical. And while it can be physical, that's not the only way that a person can be violent. So physical abuse can be things like, pushing or pulling another person, scratching, punching, biting, strangling them, kicking them, use of a weapon. But there's also a ton of different kinds of abuse, as we see in the power and control wheel. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I would encourage you all to look up power and control wheels because they have a lot of really in-depth information around domestic violence. But we know that abuse can also be emotional and verbal. It can look like put downs, calling someone stupid, calling them out of their name. It can look like yelling and screaming at a person, making them think that something physical is going to happen, even if it doesn't rise to the level of physical abuse. It can look like minimizing, denying, and blaming. A lot of minimizing, oh, I didn't hit you, or if I did hit you, it wasn't that bad. Or saying, if I hit you, it was your fault because you did X, Y, and Z. And a lot of survivors will internalize those messages. They will say, well, it was my fault that the person strangled me, or it was my fault that the person hit me because I didn't do what they wanted me to do. It can also look like psychological abuse. So this can be threats. One of the big ones is the person who's causing harm threatening to kill themselves and telling the survivor, it'll be your fault if I kill myself. And imagine that, someone tells you that, you would take that on yourself around oh my gosh, I don't want this person to die. If they die, it's going to be my fault. Another one is use of others. This can look a lot like use of children. So if there's children in the situation, the person who's causing harm might do things like saying, I'm going to take your kids away. Or they might get the kids in on the abuse, having the kids also put down their other parent, also say, harmful, negative things to them. It can look like sexual abuse. We know that sexual assault happens in domestic violence relationships quite frequently. And so people may not kind of tie those two together, but it is very common that when there is domestic violence in a relationship, there is also sexual violence. Economic abuse, which is a huge one in our area. It's so expensive to live in Santa Cruz County and the Greater Bay Area at large. And so that can be that the person who causes harm either doesn't allow the survivor to work, or they force the survivor to work and they take all of their money. It can look like not including the survivor in financial decisions, or saying, keeping power and control around all that is happening. And we don't think about the fact that economic or financial abuse, that is just as deadly as any other form of abuse. And sometimes it's more insidious, because we all know we have different kind of configurations of how people divvy up their money and all of that stuff, but it can be a very insidious, very dangerous form of abuse. And then we know digital, we live in the digital age. We could only be talking to you right now with COVID because of Zoom. And that creates a situation where now there are people who are uniquely vulnerable online, people being stalked and harassed online, and things like that. And then citizenship and residency, taking someone's papers and saying that, you know, I will deport you, or I will call ICE or immigration if you don't do what I say.
So I want to talk a little bit about the cycle of violence. I know earlier when we were asking you in the chat what you thought about when you thought about domestic violence, the cycle came up, and that's a really great point. I think it's important for all of us to realize that although domestic violence can look a lot of different ways, there is sort of a pattern that we can identify. And being able to identify that pattern can help us be a resource for survivors. So here you see the cycle of violence. It starts really, well, it's a cycle, so it can start anywhere, but there's the tension building phase. So that's typically, you know, when there's tension between the two partners. Maybe it's verbal, maybe, you know, there's a lot of fighting going on, a lot of insults, things like that. There's just tension building. And then there's an acting out phase. This doesn't necessarily need to be physical. This could be financial, for example. This could be sexual. This really could be anything, but it's sort of when you think about domestic violence and you think about all of the tension coming to a head, and there's an incident. There's an incident maybe where the survivor thinks, oh no, you know, this isn't a healthy relationship. Maybe thinks about leaving. Maybe starts trying to connect with people who might be able to assist the survivor in leaving or in escaping. But the person who causes harm knows that this acting out phase kind of catalyzes something in a survivor to think about leaving. And so then it's followed by the honeymoon phase, which you see down there with the couple holding flowers. So in order to maintain power and control, the person who causes harm oftentimes will be, you know, extra affectionate, extra kind, extra nice. Maybe we'll purchase gifts, maybe we'll plan a vacation, things like that, just sort of to maintain that power and control, and to make any thoughts that the survivor had about leaving or ending the relationship sort of disappear. Because in that phase, it's much, much harder to think about leaving when things seem so good and it resembles a healthy relationship. So following that, there will be a calm phase typically where there's not a lot of tension. It does resemble a normal, healthy relationship. And that's really a powerful tool to maintain the power and control within that relationship. But inevitably, the tension will start building again. And there will be another acting out phase, like I said, whether that's physical or not. And then the cycle will continue. So being able to identify these different phases as a survivor or as a bystander is really important, because it helps us really understand that while there are so many different domestic violence situations and it can look so many different ways, there is sort of a template. There's a template for power and control, and recognizing that template and seeing those different phases can really help us intervene if we are in a situation where a survivor does need our help. So I also want to go over some signs of an abusive relationship. These aren't all of the signs, but there's some really important ones to cover, just so then, like I said, if somebody is talking to us, or we do need to be a bystander, or if we are in a situation ourselves, we can identify some of these common signs. So number one, intensity. This could look like a relationship moving really fast. Partners saying I love you really, really early on in the relationship, maybe moving in together really soon, just taking bigger steps in the relationship sort of right away. So just really, really, you know, intense. Jealousy, so just lots of assumptions around maybe, you know, your partner accusing you of cheating on them when they see you talking to somebody of the gender that you're interested in, or sort of just assuming that you have bad intentions, or that you are cheating on them, being unfaithful, jealous, maybe even of your friends and family when you're spending time with them. Number 3, control. That's a big one. So that could look like maybe your partner telling you, you know, I don't want you to take this job, or I don't want you to go on that trip with your friend. I don't want you to do this. I don't want you to do that. Isolation is a really, really important one to talk about, especially during COVID. So as connections are cut off, so we're seeing, most of us, probably fewer people than we were seeing before, have smaller circles during COVID. And this does create opportunity for domestic violence to worsen, because as a survivor has connections with lots of family and friends, lots of outside connections, those do sort of create opportunities for the survivor to potentially get out of that relationship. You know, if the survivor's talking to a lot of different people about this unhealthy relationship, and maybe somebody's saying, hey, you know what, that seems like a red flag, that seems like a sign, that creates an opportunity for the survivor to really step back, look at the relationship more objectively, and contemplate leaving. So when a survivor is isolated, that really creates opportunity for the reverse, for the person who causes harm to say, you know, this is normal, I love you, this and that. And they really don't have a lot of outside sources to speak to about what's going on. So isolation is one we really need to think about right now. I would encourage all of us to just, you know, even if we're not communicating with everybody the way that we used to, just reaching out and checking on people that we love to make sure that they're doing okay, because sometimes that can really be a lifeline. Criticism. So this can be, you know, just general criticism of the way that the survivor is living their life, criticism of relationships with family, criticism of profession. It can really look a lot of different ways. Sabotage is another important one. So for example, let's say that the survivor is planning a trip with their family and they're really excited about it, and they're getting ready to leave, and the person who causes harm starts a really big fight. And now the survivor feels like they can't go on that trip with their family. That's not an accident, that's a tool that's used to further isolate and to sabotage plans or ideas that a survivor had previously about how they were going to spend their time and what they were going to do. And blame helps to continue the power and control that the person who causes harm wields, because if the survivor believes that everything that's happening is their fault, they're not going to really think critically about the person who's causing the harm. Anger is another one, just overreacting, threatening, lots of fights, making somebody feel afraid.
And one thing before we move on that I do want to kind of highlight on this slide is that, especially for teens, some of the things here can be really hard to distinguish because, for instance, intensity. Young teenage love is intense, you know, like that feeling of like, I love and adore this person, and not always seeing that some of that intensity, it can be tied to the other person who's causing harm, you know, enacting power and control. Similarly, when we do a lot of work in the schools, we hear that jealousy is a good thing, that, you know, teenagers will say things like, oh, and we've even heard this from adults, like, oh, being jealous of me, or them being jealous of others talking to me, makes me feel loved. And so really having to tease out what might be a normal level of intensity for a teen versus what is abusive intensity, or what might be, you know, we all get jealous, we're humans, versus an extreme abusive form of jealousy that is starting to kind of cause issues. So knowing that, you know, a lot of these things can show up in what we would consider maybe normal or healthy relationships for teens, and for adults in some cases. And so really having that education piece around when is it toxic, when is it abusive, and when is it time to get help.
So another important question that we hear a lot, people tend to say, well, why don't they leave? And that's a victim blaming question, but we understand, you know, that if somebody doesn't know a lot about this cycle, it can feel like a really empathetic question to ask. So I want to go over some of the reasons why survivors don't leave. So some examples are, as Sydney mentioned, here in Santa Cruz County and the larger Bay Area, lack of financial resources. So let's say that the person who's causing harm is the person who's on the lease, and the survivor feels like if they leave, they won't have somewhere to go. And Monarch Services does have a shelter, but not everybody knows that, and not every county has that. And so having access to that is important, but not everybody does. And so feeling like, okay, I'm going to stay with this person who's causing me harm, or I'm going to be homeless and my children are going to be homeless, that's a harder decision to make than just, oh, well, this person is being harmful, so I'm going to leave. So oftentimes there's a lot of things under the surface that are stopping somebody from leaving. And we have to really examine that before we ask this question. Threat of murder and or suicide. Sometimes domestic violence murders or things like that happen after the person has already left. Somebody has made a move to try to leave, the survivor has made a move, and the partner is, still wants that power and control and hurts them and murders them. That absolutely happens. And so if a survivor doesn't have a safe space to go where the person who causes harm can't find them, it sort of combines the lack of shelter with the threat of murder. If they feel like wherever I go, this person's going to be able to find me and hurt me, it doesn't seem like a safe decision to leave, and it's not. Social stigma. So this is a hard thing for survivors to talk about. Even if a survivor feels, senses, knows that they're in a domestic violence relationship, that doesn't mean they're going to want to disclose it to their friends or family. It can feel shameful. I think a lot of times it's human, it's natural for us to want to portray our lives, our relationships as ideal and as without problems. That's sort of, on social media, it's always we're posting the most ideal components and aspects of our lives. We're not posting mostly about our problems. And so being vulnerable in that way and disclosing even to a loved one about something harmful that's going on in your personal life can be really, really hard. Religious beliefs. So some religions, marriage is really, it's really important to stay in marriage. Divorce is really frowned upon, or leaving a relationship is frowned upon, and you don't want to feel like you're not, a good person in your faith. And that can be really, really hard. And that can play into also the social stigma, because if your family and your friends are also religious, then that can make you look not so good in their eyes, and that can really, really weigh on a person. In LGBTQI relationships, threats of outing someone. Sometimes a partner will say, well, if you leave me, I will tell everybody that you're gay. I will tell everybody that you're trans. And if that person isn't ready to come out and let their community know that, that's a really, really huge threat. And weighing those two situations against each other can be really hard. Maybe it feels more safe for them to stay in that abusive relationship than it does to come out and share about their identity when they're not ready to do that. With immigration issues, as Sydney was saying, withholding somebody's documents, threatening to call ICE or immigration on them, that's another. A lot of these are really just weighing two really, really terrible options, right? It's weighing an unhealthy relationship against something else that's also really threatening to your livelihood. So it's not easy to just leave. Keeping the family together is a big one too. Sometimes we think, well, my family will be better, if the kids are growing up with their biological mom and biological dad. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's less healthy for the children to stay with those two parents, but it's a hard decision to make. And I think that, society really reinforces that it's important for kids to grow up in a two-parent household if possible. And so it can be really hard to make that decision, even though it might be safer for your children to leave. Victim blaming kind of goes along with social stigma. This question is a victim blaming question. And although people can ask it with absolutely good and pure intentions, it's really important that we talk about when we're asking this question, it's not really helping a survivor. Likely they've thought about leaving, but there's other things that make it really difficult to do so. And so what we really want to do is make sure that we are providing options to them and not just our own opinions. And you know, while we might be thinking in our heads, why don't they leave? That's fine. If you're thinking that, don't say that. Don't think about, put yourself in their shoes. Think about issues that you're not seeing on the surface that might be preventing them from being able to actually leave. History of past abuse too. This can also be, of course, a factor. And a trauma bond is a really good, important one to talk about. So trauma bonding is something that happens when two or more people have gone through something traumatic together. It was previously sort of known as Stockholm Syndrome, but it's what happens when people go through something together and maybe a survivor's thinking of leaving and they're like, oh, but we've been through so much together. Or this person was there for me when I was going through this really difficult thing. When individuals go through difficult things together, even if one of those individuals is causing the difficult times, it does create a bond because there is a lot of emotion that comes with that and that comes with going through those difficult times. So there is that bond a lot of the time. And love is a really huge one too. If you love somebody, it's human nature for us to sort of not think too much about flaws that that person has if we love somebody. You know, we want to paint them as this really perfect, great, amazing person, and we want to put aside things that don't please us about them. And love is something that can absolutely keep a survivor in an abusive relationship, and we should not shame them for that.
And one thing too, kind of with the history of abuse, if we can just go back to the previous slide, the history of past abuse is an important one to kind of consider when we talk about why don't they leave. Because we've worked with survivors who were abused as children and were abused and, you know, maybe they were in the foster care system and they were abused by their foster parents. And by the time they get into this relationship that is abusive and on the surface, you know, we might be like, oh, I'm afraid for your life. You know, we've heard survivors say like, well, it's not as bad as the previous abuse. And so that priming of abuse, that history of abuse can make it so that when tied with that love or the trauma bond, a person's like, well, it's not as bad as previous abuses I have suffered and I love this person. And if a survivor has felt a lack of love throughout their entire life, feeling as though the person who's causing harm actually loves them, whereas the other people who abuse them don't love them, that can really create a situation where they feel that, you know, it's not safe to leave or it's not worth it to leave. I'm finally being loved.
So why do people abuse others? Sorry, did you want to say something?
No, go for it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so why do people abuse others? There are many reasons I do want to point out before going through these. These aren't excuses. This doesn't make abuse okay, but when people see domestic violence relationships or situations, this is a common question that people ask. Well, why would anyone do that? You know, who would do that? Why? So a lot of times there are, you know, many components that go into why people abuse others. And as Sydney was mentioning about past trauma with survivors, there can also be past trauma with people who cause harm. So when abuse is normalized, it doesn't matter, you know, if it's for the survivor or if it's for the person who causes harm. If it's normalized, then that is something that they have in their mind as a normal dynamic. And maybe they haven't ever seen a dynamic that wasn't like that. Maybe that's something that's just the norm for that person. So power and control is, we're going to keep coming back to that throughout this presentation, because really those are some of the key tenets of abuse and what makes people abuse. Having power and control over somebody else can make some people feel better about, you know, trauma that's going on within their own lives, or trauma that happened to them when they were children or in even past relationships. Exposure to violence throughout life. So like I said, this might be the norm for some individuals. And if you've never seen anything else, you're going to assume that that's a normal dynamic. And even that that's a normal dynamic within love. If you see two people in love and that's the way that they interact with each other, you're going to sort of normalize that, especially if you're a child and you're still developing. Societal beliefs about gender roles and norms. So being exposed consistently to patriarchal ideas, patriarchal power structures, of course, that kind of ingrains itself in our minds, no matter what gender we are, you know, we internalize that. And so if we're all internalizing that, then that can become also really normalized. And for example, a man can feel like it is his right, or like it's what he's supposed to do to be masculine, to cause harm to a partner. With undiagnosed mental health issues, we want to point out that actually it's more common that the survivor has undiagnosed or diagnosed mental health issues. That is a vulnerability that, you know, creates opportunity for people to cause harm, but it could be the survivor or the person who causes harm who has diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issues. And like I said, it's not an excuse, but absolutely it can contribute, just like all of these factors can. And so really what we see as a solution is showing people alternatives. If they haven't seen alternatives to violent relationships or violent partnerships, we really want to show them those alternatives and show ways to resolve conflict that are not violent. Because of course it's okay and normal to have conflict at times in relationships. What's not okay and what should not be normal is responding to that conflict in violent ways.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about, you know, how abuse affects survivors. Because, you know, domestic violence relationships, they create trauma in the survivor. And so one of the big things we see are self-blame, guilt, and shame. Because of the blame and minimization that happens in a lot of abusive relationships, survivors start to blame themselves. If only I had done this differently. One survivor I worked with would talk about how, you know, if she cooked a meal a certain way, her, you know, husband would just freak out, abuse her. But if she did cook nothing, her husband would freak out and abuse her. So in her mind, she was like, well, I need to figure out what I can do to stop this. She's blaming herself. There can also be a lot of guilt, you know, guilt around, you know, we've heard survivors who are in really long relationships, really long DV relationships, and they feel guilty that they stayed for that long, or they felt guilty that they had children with a person who was causing harm, and a lot of shame. We have a society that, like Delphine said, we blame the survivor so much more than we blame the person who causes harm. The why did you stay question, which is so, as Delphine said, victim blaming, and really puts the onus on the survivor. And so because many survivors have internalized the abuse, they blame themselves for the abuse, and they also will blame themselves for what they did or didn't do during an attack. We hear survivors say things like, I'm just as bad as they are because I fought back. But the fact of the matter is, that is normal fight or flight. Someone is consistently assaulting you. At some point, you might fight back, you might swing back, you might push back because you're afraid and you're trying to get out of the situation. Alternately, survivors will blame themselves and feel guilty because they didn't fight back. And so much of that creates that shame. And when, you know, a survivor leaves and the first question they're met with is, why did you stay for so long, or why didn't you leave? It almost solidifies all of those self-blame, guilt, and shaming feelings, which is why we really want to avoid that question, just in total. Even if you're thinking it, don't ask it. Another big one is feelings of isolation or hopelessness. Isolation is a key part of abuse. Delphine covered that in the slides on on the signs of abuse. And so the person who is using the person who's using abuse will use isolation as a tactic to control their partner. As a result, close personal relationships between the survivor and their family or friends can be damaged, further isolating the survivor. A common one is, family and friends get exasperated. They're like, this person is abusing you again, you've gone back again, and they start to withdraw from the survivor. And now the abuse is working. The person who's causing harm wants the survivor to be isolated because it's that much easier to control them. It's that much easier to use power over them. And that isolation can lead survivors to feeling hopeless. This is never going to change. I have nowhere to go. My family has turned on me. Or alternately, depending on, cultural, religious, all those kinds of factors, the survivor's family may say, well, you have a responsibility to stay with your partner, to stay with your husband, to keep the family together. So that also leads to hopelessness. If you feel that you can't leave because you won't even have the support of your family, now you're additionally isolated and additionally dealing with a lot of hopelessness. So how do they cope? Because, we all know that, dealing with that level of trauma, that level of just stress and anxiety, it's going to show up in different ways. A big one that we see is denial. Survivors will deny that, the abuse is that bad. They will kind of just put it out in their mind, like, okay, and especially this is incredibly true in the honeymoon and calm phases of the cycle of violence, where, it's not going to happen again, or, we're going to be good from now on, and really kind of that denial piece of things, that this is actually a very dangerous cycle. Minimization, that's a huge one. Survivors will say things like, well, this time that they abused me wasn't as bad as last time. It's not that big of a deal. Or if there is a history of past trauma, they will minimize the current abuse by saying, well, it wasn't as bad as that time I was sexually assaulted, or it wasn't that as bad as the last abusive relationship I was in. Big one we just talked about, self-blame. So it's easier because we really only have control over ourselves. It's easier to blame ourselves than to acknowledge that the person who is causing harm is not going to change, or is likely not going to change. We all have the capacity to change, but does it actually happen in those situations? Another one, disassociation. So this is a big one where survivors, as the abuse is happening, as the assault is happening, kind of disassociating, going to another place. It's often called like an out-of-body experience. You're like watching yourself from like the top of the room, just not being in their body. Survivors can really disconnect from their bodies because it's easier to disassociate than to really kind of acknowledge what's going on. Big one, alcohol and drug use, which will lead to the self-blame because survivors will feel like, oh, I have all these problems, it's my fault. But the fact of the matter is alcohol and other substances and drugs are often used by survivors to minimize, tamp down, to numb out the feelings that are happening because of the abuse. And then a big one is eating disorders. That can be compulsive eating, or that can be not eating at all. And we'll hear survivors say like, oh, I've lost so much weight. And it's because of that trying to cope. When you have lost, and we know eating disorders are tied to feelings of control. And if you have no power, no control in your life because of this abusive relationship, an eating disorder can be a way of trying to regain that control.
Alrighty, so now that we've heard about the dynamics of domestic violence, coping mechanisms, and reasons why people stay and reasons why people become the abuser, we're going to talk a little bit about how to support a survivor. It's very important, of course, to listen and believe, no matter what our personal opinions are about every situation that we hear. It's important not to show that to the person, the survivor, and just to really listen and be there for that person. I think being there for someone is really important, and it provides a feeling of safetyness and openness. With that, also having an open mind, because as we've heard, sometimes we ask ourselves, well, why don't they just leave? Or well, what the heck are they doing there? Or what about their kids? It's important not to have those personal feelings when you are hearing someone out, a survivor of domestic violence or any other survivor of abuse that comes with it. Provide options, not opinions. That one's also important. And as a human, our instinct is to give our opinion or to say, well, I would do this, or, well, why don't they just go with their sister, or, leave or call the police. And that is really harmful for a survivor, especially when they're in the decision-making stage of, should I stay, should I go? It's important just to let them know, hey, this is available. I'm here for you. If you don't want like family help, I can get you, professional help. These are the numbers. Just providing options instead of opinions makes a difference, because you're not telling them, hey, this is what I would do, but instead you're saying, hey, here's what's available for you if you choose to leave or to stay. Help with a safety planning. Safety planning doesn't not need to be extensive. It does not have to be like a written out safety plan, case manager plan. It can be something simple as when somebody does come to you, helping them have like an emergency bag, meaning with like their documents, if they have children, the birth certificates, somewhere, hidden. Finding a safe space in their house when the person who causes harm is being aggressive, where they can hide and they can easily, maybe jump out of a window without it being dangerous. Helping them identify places in their house where they can keep themselves safe during the lashing out stage in the cycle of abuse. It can also look like they can have like a spare key somewhere hidden, maybe outside their front porch, their mat. If they have a plant, just in the case they need to, leave in an emergency and the person who causes harm is withholding their keys, they can have an extra pair somewhere. So small stuff like that goes a long way. It doesn't have to be expensive at all. And it's stuff that, maybe the survivor hasn't thought about, or they haven't, that hasn't crossed their mind. So us being able to provide that really is helpful. Reminding them it's not their fault. Of course, that's a big one. It's always important to, reinstate it's not your fault, especially because a lot of survivors do victim blaming. I'm sorry, not victim blaming, self-blaming. And the way we ask questions or the way we like say certain things, we do have to be careful, because as Delphine mentioned, even though our intentions aren't to victim blame, at times they can come out that way. So it's important just to reinstate, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. Don't speak about the abuser, speak about the abuse. That's also very important, to focus on the abuse and not so much the abuser themselves. Determine a support system that goes hand in hand with safety planning. I would say help them identify safe people they can reach out to. If it's including yourself, let them know, hey, you can reach out to me as well. If they're far away from family, help them get connected to other organizations or nonprofits that could help them. Provide resources. I think that also goes hand in hand with options, giving them places they can go to. If there's a shelter, things like so. Be aware of your own biases. That one is big, for us to know how to go about that, and to be able to identify our biases too. It's important so they don't come out when you are helping a survivor. And then don't minimize the abuse. Of course, that's huge as well. I think supporting a survivor is very important. And sometimes, if we feel like we can't do it, or maybe I find it hard when it's a family member of my own or someone I know, just because there's that also emotional connection to the person. So I'll try, to give them options and not get so involved in it, just because I know there's going to be a lot of biases since it's my family or my friends. So knowing that there's somewhere like Monarch is important as well. And here at the end, remember, you are there to empower someone, not to rescue them. They must make their own choices and what is best for them. That's super important to remind ourselves. Sometimes things don't work out the way we would want them to, or survivors, end up staying with the person who causes harm. That is totally their choice. Your purpose is to empower them and let them know there is choices out there for them. And with that being said, I'm going to speak briefly on Monarch services. I won't go into depth about every single service we have. You can also go to our website, and all our programs are on there. But our biggest one is our crisis line. It's free. It's available 24 hours a day, every day. There's always an advocate on there to answer people's questions, or, you know, if they are in an emergency situation, but they don't want to call law enforcement, the advocate can help them create a safety plan. We have our counseling for our survivors, and if there's children involved, the children can get counseling as well. We also do advocacy with law enforcement, with other agencies. We have our confidential emergency shelter. It's at an undisclosed location, and it's for survivors in danger. And then we recently, Monarch Services, I saw somebody asked about the abuser, intervention for the abusers. We recently do have a program that's reflective of the batter's intervention programs, except it's a more trauma-informed program. So I actually co-facilitate that program with a therapist, and we are a little more trauma-informed, and our approach is to not only let the abuser know, you know, we're there to help them, but also violence is a learned behavior. I'm a big believer that violence is a learned behavior. So our goal is to help them replace those learned behaviors and those patterns, violent patterns, with healthy communication patterns. That's really the goal of the program. And also to help them dive into their childhood wounds, because a lot of abusers have previous exposure to trauma. So help them dive into those wounds and help them heal from those wounds, because they need to heal that first in order then to, you know, move on and adapt these new healthy communicating patterns and things like so. So Monarch does have that available as well for the person who causes harm. We don't call them abusers. And it can be self-referred, so a person can, you know, inquire about it. Or we also do take referrals from Family and Children Services, formerly known as CPS, or probation as well. So that is available through Monarch Services. So essentially we are trying to help the family unit as a whole, to help them build safer, non-violent dynamics and in their families.
So here, rather than the power and control wheel, we have the freedom and equality wheel. So this just shows sort of some components to a healthy relationship, things that we should be seeking out, things that are not red flags, but actually are healthy. And really fast, I'm just gonna pop in a link right there to the chat. That is the Healthy Relationships quiz. That's a quiz that I would encourage you to share with anybody that, you know, shares with you they might be feeling like they're not sure if their relationship is healthy. Sometimes it can feel really nuanced and we don't know for sure. And since there is that social stigma that we talked about earlier, not everybody feels comfortable asking a family member or a friend, hey, do you think this is healthy? So for somebody who doesn't want to ask those questions, or who you might suspect should be asking those questions, but since there's the social stigma, I would definitely recommend just passing along that quiz as a resource. It's just a really great way for you to be able to navigate, you know, what's healthy and what's unhealthy, but without having to disclose everything that's going on in your relationship to somebody if you're not ready to do so. So this wheel just shows, like I said, some positive behaviors that we should be seeking out in relationships. So non-threatening behavior, talking and acting so that everyone feels safe and comfortable expressing themselves. Respect, of course, is a huge one. Trust and support, honesty and accountability, shared responsibility, responsible parenting, and economic partnership. Negotiation and fairness. So what you'll see as a trend with these is sort of shared or partnership. It's that there's equity there. It's that responsibility is divided, and also decision making is divided as well. So really it is mutual support and mutual respect for one another. And that's really what we're seeking out and looking for everybody as we try to replace violence with healthy communication and healthy partnership.